Falsetto comes profoundly perverse, a freakish sideshow, the place where voice goes wrong. Wayne Kirstenbaum wrote this in 1993's The Queen's Throat. Uncomfortable with that part of his voice that causes effeminacy to become audible, he fears his listeners will ascribe it to him. Tony Heilbut's 2012 essay on the male soprano expresses the opinion that both sexes are enthralled to hear their natural pitches claimed by a foreign power, end quote. Clearly, though male falsetto has slowly gained acceptance in both classical and popular cultures, starting with the contemporaneous phenomena of Alfred Deller and the boy bands of the 50s through the 70s, and markedly in the 20 years between these last two authors, it is still viewed askance in today's operatic world, outside of the sporadically tolerated countertenors and male sopranos. A tenor dare not use it lest he be mocked. And that's the last word on tenors, countertenors, and male sopranos. As the term itself is fraught with many, often conflicting physiological, euphemistic, and coloristic definitions, I wish to clarify what I mean for today by falsetto. Modern vocal understanding has given many names to divisions within the singing voice. However, the critical and pedagogical understanding of the registers of the voice in the late 18th and early 19th centuries was comparatively simple. With very few exceptions, it was of a two-register voice for all voice types, female, male, and castrate, adult, child, and adolescent. These divisions were most often denominated Bruststimme, Falsett, and Falsett, Kopfstimme, or Fistelstimme in German, writing of the period, again for all voices. The chest voice was also variously known as voce di petto, voce naturale, natural voice, voix du poitrine, with modern pedagogy adding modal register, M1, strong register, speaking register, and many more. The falsetto, and the following terms are merely broadly synonymous, was and is known as the voce finta, voce bianca, voce di testa, voix de la tête, falsett, head voice, feigned voice, with modern additions of M2, weak register, light register, isolated head voice, and many, many, many others. For the, however, considerably narrower purposes of this paper about male falsettists, comic female impersonators in 19th century Austria and Germany, I believe a falsetto then was what a falsetto now is. Quite simply, the upper register of a two-registered voice. A falsetto is a falsetto is a falsetto. In 1822, when the last operatic castrato, Giovanni Battista Velluti, sang in the premiere of Rossini's Il vero omaggio at the Congress of Verona, he was heard by the Duke of Wellington, by Prince von Metternich, and a host of other titled dignitaries, soldiers, and politicians. John Abers wrote in 1828 that, quote, everybody applauded Velluti except an old Austrian officer who thought nothing good outside of Germany. But is this not good, they said to him. Yes, it is good. But I know a man at Vienna that would sing it as loud again, twice as loudly. Reading this not as hyperbole or musical provincialism, but as simple reporting of perceived fact, the old officer could very well have been referring to a few men singing soprano in Vienna. Though after Velluti's visit there in 1811, there were apparently no further appearances by singing castrati as opposed to castrati in retirement, there were in 1822 at least 3 prominent adult male falsettists in Bavaria and Austria. In December 1818, Adolf Beuerle's and Ignaz Schuster's Posse, or farce, Die Falsche Catalani, often changed by censors to Die Falsche Primadonna or Die Falsche Diva, premiered in Vienna. Schuster, nearing 40, was a well-known bass, an able composer and comedic actor, and less well-known, as this detail was left out of not only his late 19th century biographies, but out of his modern ones as well, a talented falsettist and female impersonator. The farce, playing on soprano Angelica Catalani's enormous fame, features a young student named, appropriately enough, Lustig, who spends more than half the evening in drag, disguised both physically and vocally as the celebrated diva. This is done in order to, through somewhat preposterous machinations and quite a bit of singing, gain approval for his marriage to his sweetheart from her rather stupid but music-loving father. Schuster sang the title role of the false Catalani himself. He had already sung another title role in a parody of Rossini's Tancredi in 1817, with most of the solos kept from the original. He was, quote, unbeatable as Tancredi. He was from head to toe in costume, movement, poise, and eyes and gesture, the truest and at the same time the most respectful copy of Madame Gentile Borgondio. With the purest, most effortless falsetto voice and with a softness and tenderness, with a vocal method worthy of the best trained Italian artists, he performed the entire role, uniting all the voices of our great theatrical public in a well-deserved tumultuous ovation. Perhaps tellingly, or for the modern revival of musical roles using falsettists, annoyingly, here the non-castrated man was using falsetto not to fill the role of the hero Tancredi, but rather to fill the role of a then famous female interpreter of Tancredi, she playing the hero. The man did not play the man, he played the woman playing the man. Karl Blumenfeld took over the role from Schuster of the false Catalani at some point after 1821, though not before the latter sang a performance with the real Catalani in the loge. As much on display as the actors on stage, she took the persiflage gracefully, laughing and clapping at all the appropriate places. But, nearly 10 years younger, Blumenfeld's soprano falsetto quickly made him the pseudo-diva of choice. From Lindau's Reisebibliothek in 1880, quote, in the 20s, Karl Blumenfeld, the nephew of Anna Gottlieb, for whom Mozart was Pamina, made himself monstrously like Catalani. His falsetto, sounding like the purest soprano, was praised as a phenomenon. Henrietta Sonntag taught him all her bravura arias. This is important. In all of Germany and Austria, he was celebrated and applauded. As the Stuttgarter Über Land und Meer remembered him in 1885, quote, in this time, the 1820s, Herr Blumenfeld created a special kind of furore. He had a phenomenal falsetto which sounded like the most beautiful soprano and which he trained in the most difficult coloraturas. He traveled half the world as the false Catalani and aroused everywhere indescribable enthusiasm. His entire twirling modus, tournure, was gracefully feminine. He copied Catalani in all her nuances, in her coquetries, in her toilette, in every movement. Blumenfeld wasn't alone in his willingness to follow Schuster's lead, donning the regalia of an extravagant performative femininity, both vocal and sartorial. Friedrich Kirchner, a Munich-based actor-singer, though his voice was quieter and lower than Blumenfeld's, emerged in the late 1820s and early 30s as the preferred false Catalani. He traveled with the role to Paris and to St. Petersburg, where he sang for delighted Tsar in his court. Another falsettist, an otherwise forgotten actor named Keller, performed the role several times in and around Dresden, in the mid-1820s. The piece and the role stayed in the repertoire until at least 1860, sung by a succession of more or less capable falsettists, though a performance that year in Linz with the false Catalani in Freistmantel was unfavorably compared to those of Schuster, Blumenfeld, and Kirchner. It was Blumenfeld's rough, powerful, and astonishingly flexible voice, however, that remained for most observers the definitive false Catalani. A soprano with a huge range and seemingly very little fear, he on at least one occasion undertook the arias, both apparently, of the Königin der Nacht, though in what key is not exactly clear and only with mixed success. In the first aria, he encountered significant difficulties and couldn't reach the intended goal. This probably being the fiendishly difficult high F at the end of the last long run, a note that will elude a non-trivial percentage of female queens of the night on any given evening. But in the second aria, he powered through, griffe durch, and won applause. It's funnier in German. Blumenfeld's portrayal of Catalani also engendered far more negative criticism than the portrayals of Schuster and Kirchner, at least partially because, like those of his singing, his, quote, too passionate and wild acting choices were made with little regard for social mores. Schuster's false Catalani was tame enough that Catalani herself could enjoy it, and his 1817 Gentile Borgondio as Tancredi was, quote, true yet respectful. Kirchner's false Catalani was neither vocally nor dramatically as impressive as Blumenfeld's, but it was more polite. His singing was only mezzo voce, often actually too quiet, but his style was correct. The feminine twirl was good, though it lacked the coquettish lissomeness of his predecessor, Blumenfeld, but was, perhaps because of that, much more respectable. But it may have been more than a mere lack of respectability that motivated Blumenfeld's detractors. An outraged critic writing from Mainz in February 1824 spluttered angrily, breathlessly about Blumenfeld dividing both the person and the role into two distinct warring halves. The critic sarcastically saw Blumenfeld's masculinity as having been put into question by his preferring to perform femininity. Quote, "It appears he cultivates female roles in falsetto," end quote, and his chest voice as having been destroyed by the falsetto. Quote, "A chest voice made hoarse by the falsetto," or "the chest voice of Herr Blumenfeld is essentially ruined." Though the critic praises Blumenfeld's falsetto for its, quote, "purity, cultivation, and height," end quote, he or she sees in this very quality a dangerous desire not to play a student playing a false diva, but that, quote, "it is almost as if Herr Blumenfeld actually wants to emulate Catalani." In the penultimate, difficult to impossible to translate, somewhat run-on sentence, the writer opines that as it is a part of the theatrical art that an actor must play an effeminate man, he should nevertheless not confuse the genders, using the falsetto only where the chest voice ends, as with yodeling. Blumenfeld couldn't play his own gender, according to this critic. Thus, all the well-sung falsetto arias wouldn't save his audience from disappointment as they missed the chest voice singing. They missed the man, lustig. The implications reach far wider than merely switching to chest voice, of course. I believe the Mainzer critics saw in Blumenfeld an inability to balance his two sides and a dangerous, pernicious tendency to allow the feminine to dominate to the detriment and eventual destruction of the masculine. Whereas with a wink and a nod, Kirchner and Schuster inhabited the role of a flippant male student, moving into and out of the role of a false diva, Blumenfeld's affinity for the feminine and his skill made him almost seem to want to become the real diva. In 1824, a very dangerous gender play indeed. Late in Veluti's London period, a quartet of singers calling themselves the Bohemian Brothers appeared on the London concert stage, dubiously promoted and trained by the noted harpist, composer, forger, bigamist, wife-stealer, and all-around scallywag Nicholas Boxa, himself of undeniable Bohemian descent. The quartet's most extraordinary voice was a falsetto soprano called by many amused critics, including the following, the, quote, Bohemian Veluti. He was, quote, a man of authority among the party. His treble is so perfect and so acute that he might be taken for a near relative of Signor Veluti. He knows what he is about, is by no means oppressed by bashfulness, has some taste after a certain way mixed with a feverish sort of vivacity. He trills and runs up and down his passages with some dexterity, and he even treated the company with 2 or 3 variations à la Sonntag. But his shrill falsetto is far from being pleasing. In the streets, to which his voice is probably more habituated, his efforts might, in all likelihood, have a better effect. You see where I'm going with this. Though they were billed as Bohemians, the writer of the above article that appeared in early 1829 in the New Monthly Magazine relates the frankly anti-Semitic protests of his unnamed friend, a companion at that concert, a, quote, German professor of music, to the effect that these were neither brothers nor Bohemians, as there was no trace of either in their visages, but, quote, German or Dutch Jews. He does admit that, the German professor does admit that the Bohemian Veluti has a degree of training in musical knowledge. Assuming this professor's implicitly phrenological racial analysis to be more or less accurate, if hateful, a beguiling possibility offers itself. There seems to be no mention of Blumenfeld on German or Austrian stages between approximately 1828 and 1830. Sorry. This was indeed the time of Friedrich Kirchner's ascendance as the false Catalani. Given the similarities of style of singing, à la Sonntag, the height, volume, technical proficiency of his voice, and his wild, almost feverish on-stage personality, it seems at least possible that Blumenfeld was hired by Boxa through his extensive continental contacts and brought to London to don the guise of a Bohemian peasant, the Bohemian Veluti. While this is conjecture, the similarities between the third Bohemian brother and Blumenfeld are considerable, and Blumenfeld had been compared directly to a generic castrato in 1824. A harsh but cultivated falsetto reminiscent of a castrato whose voice was ruined by his love of wine. There is no other mention of another falsetto soprano of any ability during the late 1820s in Germany or anywhere else, for that matter. Kirchner was an alto with a very soft voice, and Schuster was in retirement. The popularity of Die Falsche Catalani makes it unlikely that if another voice similar to Blumenfeld's had existed, that the singer would not have also been pressed into service in the difficult-to-cast role of the false Catalani. Just as a side, I said nothing about tenors, but there was there was a falsetto tenor who toured with Liszt in the 1840s, named Luigi Pantiglione, whose chest voice wasn't very good, but falsetto voice was extravagant, and Munich critics said it's a pity that he doesn't speak German, because then they could remount Die Falsche Catalani. So it still held audiences 30 years later. Blumenfeld's inevitable aging and his inability to stop playing Catalani and many other female roles he undertook, for example, Die Schwestern von Prag by Wenzel Müller, who also composed the farce on Tancredi, or Die Wiener in Berlin by Heinrich Marschner, caused him in the end to be seen as an object lesson of both pity and censure. In 1847, Viennese newspapers somewhat ironically advertised his performance of once again Die Falsche Catalani for his benefit, hinting at penury for the then circa 60-year-old performer in the provincial theater of Laibach, now Ljubljana. Again from Über Land und Meer in 1885, quote, as the false Catalani, Blumenfeld achieved a fame that was almost worldwide. As he began to be too old to play female roles, he was, however, unable to lay down the effeminate, and so was forgotten. He sank from stage to stage. In his elderly days, he received, after long suffering, a new engagement in Agram, Zagreb. He had no money for the journey, so his former colleague, the great Ludwig Löwe, a Shakespearean actor, provided him with both clothes and money for the winter journey. Absolutely overjoyed, the old man traveled to his destination, and even before he could appear on stage, to his death. Though written in a tone of sadness, there is also the sense of a fate deserved for a boy who would not grow up. Too old to play female roles, but unable to lay down the effeminate, and so forgotten. Playing the coquette could be forgiven when the man doing it was young enough and remembered what he was. But when age stripped him and his voice of their youthful bloom, and years of both vocal and dramatic female identification stripped him of his sense of controlling masculinity, it also stripped him of the right to perform any aspect of that feminine within. Blumenfeld's disguise grew ever more uncomfortable, distasteful, and weird to his audiences. It embarrassed them. The falsetto eventually fails, but not before destroying the chest. Both unveil the true voice of an aging body that can no longer be listened to with pleasure. It becomes difficult to endure. Death and disgrace seem to stalk the singer as he sinks from stage to stage, inexorably to his end. It is one thing to be young and beautiful and to move gracefully in an intermediate ground between the sexes, flirting outrageously with both, but another thing entirely to be old and attempt the same thing. To his 19th century critics, even worse than that was to lose your own sex in the pursuit of the attainments of the other. How much time do we have? 2 minutes. So, Blumenfeld's music probably doesn't survive. This is the only the only full-scale. Sorry, getting over a cold. This is the only full-scale Falsche Catalani in manuscript, and this was sung obviously by an alto. And in any case, we don't know how often Blumenfeld sang the famous Nel corpi non mi sento variations. But it's perhaps interesting to compare the false Catalani with the real Catalani, with Velluti, who composed 8 variations on the theme in 1815, with the original. I was going to sing them, but I'm a little bit verklempt. See, does anyone, I can't really see it, just a second, have a D and a G sharp? Is that right? No, it's a little low. Mi pizziki, mi stuzziki, mi pungiki, mi mastiki is what Catalani published as the original. It's not quite the original, but all of them published original themes which are different from the actual theme, so slightly different. So Catalani, although her general affect is sort of let's see, for this variations, she this is putsiki, stutsiki, punjiki, mastiki is highly sexual. He pokes me, pinches, prods me, bites me. She avoids this one thing. Me pitsiki, me stutsiki, me punjiki, me mastiki. So she avoids sex altogether. The false Catalani, well, maybe I'll go to Veluti first. He also kind of avoids sex, although it's very clever mimetic demonstration. And then the false Catalani, this is why I don't think it's Blumenfeld, because it must go into chest voice. It's this slipping in and out of masculinity. Me pitsiki, me stutsiki, me punjiki, me mastiki. That's sort of the operatic equivalent of a banana cream pie in the face. So, and actually, without a nice round ending, that's it.